All right, good afternoon. Mr. Boyles, you good to go? Right,
Yes, Mayor, I am. Thank you.
thank you. I'll call this meeting to order. Ms. Robinson, would you do roll call, please?
Yes, just a moment. Okay, Mayor Walker,
Present.
Vice Mayor McGill,
Here.
Councilor Snook,
Here.
Councilor Payne,
Here.
Councilor Hill.
Here.
Thank you. So we're gonna, this work session today is on the FY 2023 budget development. And our first item of business is the resolution for the Charlottesville Affordable Housing Fund Program Review Design and Inclusionary Zoning Program Design. This would be our second reading. It's for $165,000. Is there a motion? We talked about this at the last council meeting and we had a first reading on it, and it would move up the process just by a week or so. So we said we would vote on it today at this meeting.
I'm happy to make the motion.
Okay.
I move we adopt the resolution for the Charlottesville Affordable Housing Fund Program Review and Redesign and Inclusionary Zoning Program Design for $165,000.
Second.
But I do think there's some discussion, that's all.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
And I just wanted to discuss publicly some of the concerns that I had raised in email with other folks on council. A concern basically about what the deliverable is going to be from the part of the proposal that involves helping design the affordable housing incentive program, bonus densities, tax abatements, whatever. There has been a lot of criticism, some merited, some probably not, but certainly a lot of discussion about the results of the efforts that we've gotten from the consultants so far, and the question of how specific the recommendations have been to what might seem like unique conditions to Charlottesville. There have been requests that the consultants do things like economic analyses. I don't know what exactly their specific proposals are, but I would hope that before things get too far along, somebody in city government, whether it's in the city manager's office, whether it's NDS, I'm not sure who, would sit down with Roadside Hardwell and figure out what specifically we're going to get in the way of an evaluation of these incentives. So I'm in favor of the effort. I just want to make sure that it gets guided before we get a final product.
Yeah, and that has been, Michael was on a meeting where we reviewed the process with NDS staff. Chip was on the meeting, former housing program manager, John Sells, who had started some of this work, the review process of it. So there was a lot of discussion around design. The same consultant team that created the affordable housing part of that we've already voted on, they will be the team that'll be working on this. And I know that there's a lot of conversation surrounding the consultants' work effort at this time, but luckily all their meetings, I think besides one and notes, are documented. One that was in the NDS conference room is the only video that I can't find. A lot of these people, including our HAC members, that are making a lot, sharing a lot of their thoughts about it now, have been involved every step of the way. And so now that there's an uproar in community for something that has been discussed, a lot of people like to point fingers and place blame, but they have been a part of these meetings and been able to influence the direction that these consultants have been taking. And so that's a big part of the conversation that we haven't been having and people haven't been taking ownership of.
Well, let me say, I am not at all displeased with the effort the Roadside Hardwell has put in. I think they've worked very hard. I think they've been very responsive to what they've been hearing from the community. I lay no fault on them. I do note that there were some questions that were directed to why didn't you do this, why didn't you do that, and their answer was that wasn't within the scope of the work that we were engaged to do. So I simply want to make sure that somebody is going to be sitting down with them and figuring out what exactly is in the scope of this last $165,000 to see, just to know whether we're going to get results that are in fact tailored to Charlottesville. That's all.
And
Thank you, Mayor. Just Mayor and Council. I've got Deputy City Manager Sam Sanders is prepared just to give a brief overview, because I do think in this case we have two very distinct deliverables that will be provided by the consultants. We've spent a lot of help from Alex and Brenda with our housing and redevelopment, putting together this scope. But I'll ask Sam just to go over those, not just the deliverable for the inclusionary zoning, but also the deliverable for the inventory of the last 10 years, but briefly.
Okay, all right, I'm happy to be able to do that for you. I actually presented this to the HAC last week to give them an idea of what this proposal, this contract was to do. It is really to take a look at CAF and look at the past allocation summary and look at the production under that. Basically looking at who we gave money to, how much did we give it to, give to them, when did we give it to them, and what were the expectations. And then there'll be the analysis of what were the deliverables that we were able to track through whatever reporting, whether they did or not. In addition to looking at what our internal records are, they will be doing site visits and interacting with some of those partners and looking at what the process is and what the relationship has been to more or less come back as the second part of that to give us an idea of how we can make improvements so that future NOFAs and RFPs will be influenced by the work that they actually perform. It'll help us look at a scoring model so that we can implement one to go forward so that we are fair and equitable in the distribution of the funds based on how we score. And then just bringing back to our attention what tools and best practices we might need to take a look at and adopt as we go forward. That's task one. Task two is to look at the inclusionary zoning program. And what I'll say in that regard, again, is having presented this to HAC, this was so that they would be aware of what was going on, to allow them a chance to weigh in on what they heard. But the goal of it was to have the consultants help us design what an inclusionary zoning program could look like. And it is really intended to be able to be a document and a series of documents, I would assume, that we can take a look at as staff, come up with our recommendations, and then they come to you as the council to then process, digest, and come up with what our actual Charlottesville program would look like. It is not in any way an attempt to take an inclusionary zoning program that some other city has been using and just bring it here and say, here, adopt this and use it. It's intended to inform the process that we would take it through to develop whatever our program is going to look like.
I do have one question now. In the deliverables look, will that also be looking at affordable housing that should be provided by developers as part of their SUPs?
Yeah, I mean, they'll make recommendations to us, and I think that's part of what you will be able to do is determine how to take that recommendation and where to place it and to what criteria you put along with that.
I meant historically as part of our affordable housing inventory. Will it also be looking at how that has been successful or not successful?
I'll call on Alex to see if, did you have that conversation? That wasn't part of what I.
Yeah, they will be looking at that, and then they will be making recommendations in line with what Sam just outlined. They will be looking at all that.
I appreciate you asking that, Stina, because that is a really good point, and it comes in two ways. There's the amount of money that sometimes developers then forego and put towards the fund, which obviously would be in the scope, but then there's just if they decide to actually build units. We know that we've had some projects that units have been built, but they actually haven't been able to be leased out for reasons that can be complicating at times. But I think it really would be helpful to understand that dynamic as well for those developers who actually were attempting to or have committed to, and making sure that they have followed through on those commitments and understanding how many of those commitments they were able to follow through on and what hurdles exist so that we can prevent kind of repeating that in the future. So I appreciate that question.
All right, are there any other questions? Okay. Ms. Robinson, would you call the vote, please?
Mayor Walker,
Yes.
Vice Mayor McGill,
Yes.
Counselor Hill,
Yes.
Counselor Payne,
Yes.
and Counselor Snook.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That carries 5. Oh. Mr. Bowles, do you want to start with an introduction? Okay, and we'll have the strategic plan followed by a discussion on the budget development process. I think all of these things are just going to flow, so I'll just state them now. Then we'll have the fiscal year 2023 budget development expectations, and then the council budget development priorities will be the discussion topics for the day.
Thank you, Mayor. And you are so correct. All of this will flow together, and hopefully we'll also be following the same format that our budget process will with the development of a strategic plan. I will go through what we're proposing there both immediately for the FY23 budget, and then also what we intend to do to get back on schedule with a 3-year strategic plan process, beginning with the FY24 and running through the FY26 budget. Following this presentation, Chrissy Hamill and Ryan will bring up and discuss with you the process for the FY23 budget to include a schedule, as well as a few, while I won't call them decision points, but at least directional points that we will need from you, just because the financial items are so large. And with that, we'll be talking about the reconfiguration of the school and a couple of capital improvement plan projects that decisions do have to be made on in the very near future. But leading up to that, we have been working on, I know that I have been talking with you for several months now about how to get back on track with our strategic plan process. And if I could get Brian, he's beat me to it, to begin to pull this up for me. We're beginning, because of timing, to take a look at this in 2 different scenarios. First, to look at one more extension to our existing strategic plan, just because we want to be able to get council and the public and our department's input prior to our departments being able to submit their budgets to me, so that we can put together the city manager's budget and get to you in March. The department's budgets will be due to the city manager's office around November 1st. So they'll begin working on those anywhere from 30 to 60 days prior. So we will be looking to get your direction, and that comes from input to include the community prior to that point for key directions. We aren't at this point proposing to look at mission, vision, goal type changes, but more of just strategic initiatives of projects and direction that you may want to see in the FY23 budget. Brian, if you'll switch to the next page, you'll see in this presentation, and for those of you that have been on council for a couple years, you've seen the P3 logo and of planning, performing, and perfecting when it comes to our strategic plan process. This was a program put into place with our leadership team and with council several years ago. It had proven very successful and was really gaining some momentum. And then during the time of transition and the pandemic, we've kind of lost that momentum, but we hope to be bringing that back. And it's just a coordinated way for the staff to work with the council and with the public in having an ongoing, all year round strategic plan process of looking at results as well as financial planning for the upcoming year. On the next slide, the P3 is a core team. It just promotes and champions the strategic planning process. It helps to create the systems that are necessary. And it's the communication and coordination between the public, the council, and all of the leadership at the city organization to keep this running year round. The next slide just gives an idea of some of the leadership that have been involved with the P3 and the strategic planning process, city manager's office, police, fire, a lot of our departments with the largest budgets and the largest number of employees have all participated in the past. On the next slide, we begin to take a look at both the history and where we then will be going with our strategic planning process. This all really began back in 2008 and was working quite well. In 2014, the 15-17 strategic plan was adopted. In 2017, the 18 to 20 plan was adopted. But then the past 2 years, and including the current fiscal year, will be extensions of that FY 18 and 20 plan that was adopted. This will be an update without major changes, but what it will do is provide us the entry level so that when we're developing the FY 24 to 26 strategic plan, which will be not an update, but a complete new development plan that will relook at mission, vision, as well as the strategies and activities that council wants to see city government work towards. What we'll be looking at is that in May to August of next year, that would be when we would really be putting that plan together so that we'd be bringing it to you in August of 2022. The next schedule or next slide. Thanks. For the current budget that we'll begin working on for FY23.
I have a question.
Sure.
Question. So
Yeah,
you
thanks.
said May to August, you'll be bringing the strategic plan to council?
Yes, of next year.
So what is council role in the development of that plan?
Oh, we will be working both with council, with the public, and with staff.
Okay.
We'll be hiring a consultant and facilitator that will be not only working with you individually and in teams, but also be utilizing you to go to the public and have the public come to you with their input.
Okay.
Yeah.
Make sure, because part of when we tried to do this update, Sina, that meeting was what, last year or earlier this year? At a certain point, but we had a leadership meeting after our failed attempt to start this process earlier last year. And I think it was my perspective of that meeting was that there wasn't alignment, which I'm hearing from you. That's why I asked just for clarification on whose plan this was and who was responsible, for it. And I think it's very important for us all to understand that we are all doing this on behalf of the citizens, that there should be lots of influence from them and just not the citizens who usually have access to people, in leadership, and that these departmental plans should be influenced by this plan. And I just hope that has been communicated in that way.
Very much. And it's one of the reasons you'll notice Matter of fact, Brian, if you could back up another slide. Previously, the plans were brought to council in June after the first year of the 3-year cycle's budget was already adopted. We're really changing that up so that council would adopt the strategic plan before we even begin development of the next year's budget. For me, in addition to the performance management of this program, it's so instrumental for the staff to receive direction from the council and for council to receive input and direction from the public prior to the departments putting together their annual budget, so that they will know where they're headed, what they're trying to accomplish. And as you said, Mayor, it's that three-legged stool. It's three different groups working on this, but getting it done prior to working on the budget. It's so crucial, and so we're moving it way up so that this would actually be approved prior to the departments even beginning their budget process. So thank you. The next slide again, starting to get into a little more detail of the current. Knowing we do not have time to accomplish a 3-year strategic plan prior to having the departments who will begin their budget prep in September to October 1st is kind of the last moment they can start working on their budgets. We just wanted to update the current plan. What we are hoping to do is to have a workshop with you. We're proposing early in September. Hopefully that would allow us a hybrid type meeting where those who wanted to be there in person could, as long as they were safely distanced. And then we would also have the virtual capacity for both the elected officials and the citizens. Again, all of this is contingent upon our COVID levels staying in a very positive way. There could be the likelihood that we do extend our current state of affairs past the current estimated time of September 7th. But anyway, we're going into this optimistic. We're hoping to bring council together for about 4 hours in a workshop setting that would allow department heads to present their initiatives, for the council to present their initiatives, and then for the citizens to have input as well. We would come out of that with a lot of different items, and then staff working hopefully with a facilitator would then put this together and group like items together, look at things that are multi-year in nature, and then come back to you with a draft of these strategic plan initiatives for your review. Then we would revise that with your input, with the public's input, with the department's input, and then come back to you in early October for a final approval. That would give enough time to get it to the department heads for them to utilize in putting their budget packages together to submit to the city manager's office. Next slide.
Sorry, really quick.
Question? Sure.
A couple logistical questions. So number one, so this September 11th date is the date we're targeting. I just want to make sure we all block our calendars because that's a Saturday.
It's a Saturday morning.
Okay. And then number two, what kind of prep in advance of that will we be able to so that we're all kind of making the best use of that time? Like, what will staff be providing to us for consideration? Like, how many priorities? I just want to make sure that we are as prepared as possible.
No, we will give you a very detailed, and we've already begun looking at it from the perspective of trying to give council 5 minutes each to just, kind of rapid fire what your priority initiatives would be. We would then give the department heads 3 minutes each to provide theirs, and then the public 3 minutes each to provide theirs. We would give you the current strategic plan we would also supplement that with certain projects that have come about that were not in the strategic plan. So we would be able to give you that, and we would also give you some direction of trying to keep this at a high level. If it's creating jobs, it may not necessarily be how to create those jobs, but that the initiative is to create jobs for individuals that are either currently unemployed, getting out of incarceration, or at a certain income level. So we would be looking for that, but we would provide you with all of that ahead of time so that this can go as quickly and efficiently as possible. For me, 4 hours would be the extreme. I would like to get this done between 3 and 4 hours in a work session. After 4 hours, it's pretty tough to keep the attention span. Should we have to come back, we could certainly do that, especially with the virtual capabilities. It would make it easy. But we would give you plenty of prep time. Also, I will very likely begin to, if your time is available, begin to meet individually, possibly even on a weekly basis, just to talk budgetary items, rather than as we meet now about all items, keeping some meetings strictly for budget only. Hopefully that helps. Okay. The next slide, if you will. This then takes us a year later, when we're putting together, or almost a year later, is that we will have the need for a new plan. As a mentor county manager once told me, he said, Chip, if you have one new council member, you have a new council. And so come January, we will have a new council that will be considering that following year's budget. We want to have extensive community meetings. We want to be able to meet with individual counselors. We want to make sure that we're determining the right performance measures, things that are simple to put numbers to make sure if we're being successful with our endeavors or not, working with all of our departmental and leadership team, and then also to look at some of our peer cities. It's also, when you're looking at different departments, it's good to at least look and see what other cities with our similar budgets, with our similar populations, what they spend per capita on something like education, law enforcement, affordable housing, things like that. As mentioned earlier, in May or so, we'll begin to work on the plan development itself, working with the council, the public, and our leadership, and then get to you in August a draft that we would then begin to massage until we can get it to for your approval, hopefully somewhere around late August. And that was, okay.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and again, that's the 3-year plan. We would then update that annually, but without major changes.
Last year, again, when we attempted to update the organizational values, I think that is going to be key no matter what year we're working on, especially for the departments. I'm thinking again back to the work that Mike Murphy and Kaki did during his interim process with trying to get a feel for how well departments understood equity. And I hope a new council doesn't mean that that isn't like the foundation of all the work that we do and that somehow stays at the forefront. But it was pretty clear through the efforts that they did with communicating with department leaders that there was not a real understanding of that. And whatever that role, however that is prioritized, if it's going to be effective, there needs to be some kind of understanding, which I think that mission value statement has to be key. And based on the work that they did, there needed to have been some training.
And I think that's why it's so important with the FY 24 to 26. I mean, we will have the current strategic plan to work from, but to me, everything is game, and it's something that we need to reemphasize. I'll say in the current plan, while equity is mentioned, it's not highlighted. And so we would have that opportunity with the 24 to 26 plan to really look at things that have changed within our organization and within our community within the last 4 years.
Yeah, and I guess the fact that we haven't had this update happen to date, and it should have happened before now, is the reason that is not clear. But I think no matter whether it's the year process or a 3-year process, that needs to be emphasized.
Sure. Not to try to put any ideas, but that could very well be one of the strategic initiatives that becomes a priority out of the current, for the current budget. Even though we're only updating the existing strategic plan, that would be something for council to consider being a priority with the upcoming update to the strategic plan. So it doesn't have to wait until the next year's plan. Okay. Next slide. This is just a copy of the current plan. It's the organizational values as well as the goals, the 5 goals. What we would be working on with the update plan coming up in September would be just making sure that the initiatives that are brought forward all fall within these 5 goals and also follow and meet our organizational values. For Councilor Hill, this is the type of stuff we will provide you the full strategic plan as it is right now. There is also on the next slide some of the initiatives that you all have recommended in the past that we're working from now. So we'll be able to provide all of these to you prior to that meeting. Some of the things that just make this a little bit different than what's been going on in the past is it does give a very timely direction to the departments for how they prepare their budgets. It creates a avenue for conversations about exactly what is strategic planning and how do we measure it? How is the departmental performance measured from the success or non-success? Also creating conversations, not just about what needs to get done, but how things get done. It creates an avenue for community of residents as well as the city council to engage with the organizational staff, and hopefully we'll have better execution of the plan and be able to document the accountability of the performance. These are the goals that we'll be striving for. And today we just ask for, you've been very helpful with the feedback and questions you've already provided, but any other type of feedback we'd appreciate. And we'll be talking with you in small groups and individually as we put this schedule together so that you're very much in agreement and familiar with the direction that we're taking. And we can answer any questions.
I have a comment about I do like the idea of hearing department leaders' presentations. I think that's something that's been missing, and it will give us more information to be able to either advocate on their behalf or at least tell them why we chose to allocate funding to another, something else other than what they were recommending. But I also think there needs to be and I know that people have said that this is somewhere, but a list that's created that, out of each budget cycle for just prioritizing the request in order if we did have the funding and putting the reasoning behind why that's at the top of the list. because I think that will help with the next budget cycle. So when department leaders are saying that I've been requesting the same thing for 3-5 years or whatever, we at least would have, record of that. And I know that staff has said in the past that they have that, but it's just been hard at least for me to be able to answer some of those questions.
Sure. Most definitely, Mayor. These types of plans are not just important for the current year, but they start to set up the future so that we can see reoccurring themes of things that are of high interest. And it does then give the ability sometimes to say, well, if we can't fund this particular thing, what if we combine it with something else that then makes it more palatable? So it does help us, and it most certainly is a multi-year effort.
And I know I'm kind of a broken record. I said this earlier, but I just thinking through this process, and if we have all, obviously we're going to hear from the community, we're going to hear from senior leadership in the organization and from counselors. I just think that either we know exactly, I mean, you mentioned there's more than one meeting for this, but I'm just trying to think again at this September, on the 11th, what we can see ahead of time so that we're all coming kind of with all the information available to us so we can all work together to kind of see what the themes are and where there's that alignment versus trying to just all be hearing it for the first time in that meeting. And I'm sorry if I'm just repeating myself, but it's just, as we talk about this, I just feel really strongly that it would be more helpful, I know, for me to just have, what my colleagues are feeling, what staff's feeling, just, even if it's at a high level, just those themes. And so we can really make the best use of that conversation. We're all together and maybe even come in with a summary of like, this is what we've been hearing across the board, or these are where things are majorly different. And so I'm just thinking out loud, but that's just something that I think would be beneficial.
We'll work very, very strongly for that because it is very, very important. I don't have to tell you all is that this effort is designed to get the consensus of council. It's really not designed for one council person's, initiative. If you know ahead of time, and so you can start working together so that hey, this theme is something all of council is behind, or at a minimum 3 of council is behind, then very clearly that gets its way into the budget, more so than to have everybody out there with very different individual type of requests. So I think that's very important, and the more we can get that to you early, the more we can help you all to build consensus for whatever is the highest priority.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Any other comments, questions?
One comment that I would make is that we had talked about doing something with the strategic plan last year, and I will just say that I think this is a much better thought out approach than what was being contemplated last year for various reasons, and I'm not going to get into all of who and why, but I'm really encouraged by the way that this is, by the way that you are thinking about it, and with the hope that we will be able to come out with a product that is truly ours rather than just the last one that came out of City Hall.
Thank you. That's our goal. That's our goal. The only other thing I'd say with it, our goal is simple and understandable. You won't mind putting this in a backpack and taking it with you somewhere. We want it to be very easy and manageable and easy to follow. I've seen these before. Try to include everything, and you end up just being unusable. So that's one of our other goals with this.
So have we seen that, Chip?
With that, thank you again. I will turn it over to Chrissy and Ryan to take us forward. I do want to take this time because we may get into some really meaty subjects later in the discussion, but I have the misfortune to be the bearer of news that we're losing Mr. Davidson at the end of August. He had some professional opportunities that he is able to take advantage of. He has been a great asset to the city for 16 years or so. And he will be sorely missed, especially at budget time, but the rest of the year as well. But just wanted to tell you all that and have you join me in, and wishing him well. But he'll sorely be missed. With that, I will let him earn his keep for the next 30 days and turn this over to he and Chrissy. Thanks.
Could we comment?
No, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Next.
No, you're the mayor. Tell him no. I told him no, and he didn't listen to me.
But yeah, that's Ryan. Well, have enjoyed your energy from the very first project that with the vibrant community, trying to reshape that when I first got here, and always welcome. While I know you had to be frustrated at times, you really just try to get the information that's requested and presented, and lots of knowledge and history. So I really enjoyed the time. So sorry to hear that, but I hope that your next endeavor works for you professionally and personally.
Thank you.
And I'm just at a loss because I wasn't prepared for this. But I can't say enough. I mean, you've been the continuity for the budget team, because when we first came on council, and we lost one of our other budget folks around that time, and you've been here through the whole thing. And as Nakia said, we certainly work closely with you, not just through the evaluation process for Vibrant Communities Fund, but obviously every year that we've been kind of pushing through with this. But also, I just can't imagine you and Chrissy without each other. So I'm just trying to put myself in Ms. Hamill's shoes as well. So can't thank you enough. It's just been a pleasure working with you. And I'm sorry for this news, but happy for you. I'm sure this is, a great thing. So thank you.
Thank you.
No.
But I just want to say thank you to each and every one of you. I have enjoyed working with you, as frustrating as I know it has been for you. It's been frustrating all around, but it's been great at the same time, because we work through the problems and come to what I think is always has the citizens' needs and the city's needs at heart, and trying to come to that compromise and the best solution that meets the needs of everyone. And I truly believe that each and every one of you has the best intentions and the best needs of the city and the citizens at heart. And I've appreciated that. And I've learned, I'd like to think that I've learned something from each of you and from everyone I've worked with. And I'll miss the people and the family here at the city, but I'm happy to be moving on to a good opportunity. So thank you.
Good luck.
And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Chrissy to do the work session piece of this.
So good afternoon. I'm going to try to be cheery and happy. We're going to ignore those last few minutes, let Ryan enjoy it. But we're going to talk a little bit about the budget process going into this year. I also want to take this time to introduce and let you know that we do have a new member in the budget office. Brian Ray was previously in Parks and Rec, and he'll be coming over not to necessarily fulfill a role that Ryan has been filling, but to work in the background and help us to put more things online, to be more transparent, to provide more visuals. And so he's working on some really exciting things that we're looking forward to pushing out with this process to help address just providing more information related to the budget. So I do want to welcome him as well. And with that, if we could just move on to the next slide. The budget is a cycle. We start, we finish, and as soon as we finish one, we're on to the next one. So if we think about this in terms of the beginning, staff works throughout the year in terms of planning. We're working on forecast. in teams such as the revenue team. For the monthly reports that Ryan's been presenting to you, there are a team of folks who are looking at those numbers constantly and working on those forecasts. Departments are working on their budget submissions. We're also working on, the initiatives and the things that are set forth in the strategic plan. Those kind of happen all year, but they certainly get pushed into, to the forefront as we begin the budget cycle. We're starting to look at that and kick those off again. Sort of the next stage is once the submissions, I'm sorry, can you go back? So the next part of that is that once the staff has sort of put all those pieces together, the budget staff, along with the city manager, begins to review all that information and develop a proposed budget that ultimately the city manager will present to you all in the official form as the proposed budget. From that, council will review that, take the opportunity to put your touches on it, make amendments, and you will then, as a council, formally adopt that budget. So if we move to the next slide to sort of just put some dates to that, August and September is sort of where we're going to start kicking off this budget development, both the CIP and the operating budgets. Departments will be working and submitting those throughout October, November time period. In the November and December time period, we'll be working on the CIP, presenting that to the Planning Commission. We'll also be meeting with departments. The departments will have the opportunity to meet with the city manager to discuss their submissions. Throughout January and February, we'll continue to develop the proposed budget. And in February is the very important date because that's when we're going to get down to what we think is pretty close to what our budget's going to look like and what advertised tax rate we'll be submitting. In March, the city manager will actually present his proposed budget to you. And then in March and April is when council will take the proposed budget and you will put your final touches on it to formally adopt that in April. So as we look at these dates, next slide, there are parts of this that are sort of dictated by the city code. And that, the code section is listed here. And basically, the city manager is required to present to you a proposed budget by March 15th. And he uses his judgment and the information that he gets. So in the visual below, that's basically a combination of the submissions from the departments, the budget guidelines that we'll be working on with you as part of the process, your priorities, forecasts and projections, all of that information will be put together and will be used to actually create a document of the proposed budget that the city manager will present to council. And then in addition, the next slide, council, the city code provides that you will then take the proposed budget, use the details of that, use public input, your input, and make amendments to that to what will ultimately become the adopted budget. And that must be adopted by April 15th of every year. So in a nutshell, that's sort of the process. There's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes, and that was a very short explanation. But to kind of keep it high level, that's the process. And we wanted to talk to you today, the next slide, to take this opportunity early on to talk about the things that we're going to use for the budget development and some of the sort of key decisions that will be feeding in to both the general fund budget and the CIP budget. One of the things that is kind of a continuing conversation that we started last year is the school reconfiguration project and the need for the tax increase to cover the debt service that would be associated with that. In addition, as part of this budget development, we will be looking at options and discussing options regarding the operational funding calculation or the 40% formula to see how if we increase taxes and we allocate that to the reconfiguration, then what does that do to the formula and how can we best adjust to make that work and still keep the general fund balanced? And then thirdly, we will look at the council's strategic priorities. As Chip spoke with you earlier about the process for the strategic plan, we will use the input from you, the community, and as well as our senior management to best fit those priorities and make sure that this budget is addressing those as we move through the process. So that will be sort of the starting point for the general fund. As we move on to the next slide for the CIP, again, the school reconfiguration project will be driving that process as well. We will basically begin with no new projects being requested. As we discussed last year with the 5-year plan that's put forward and the $50 million that were programmed in for the school reconfiguration, our CIP is full for a short period of time. As you will recall, we put in the $50 million and it was programmed for FY 2025. And in order to get that in, we were looking at approximately a 10 cents tax rate increase to cover that additional debt service. As those conversations have evolved through the committees that are working on that reconfiguration, the 3 points with the asterisk are things for your consideration that will need to be decided. At the last discussion, schools were asking or seeking $60 million, and that was for the reconfiguration of one school, which was Buford, as phase 1. They also requested that construction be moved forward to FY 2024, and that funding sources at this point would be unknown for phase 2, which would be Walker, the Walker campus. Again, West Main is still a decision point that will need to be discussed. Currently there is $18.25 million that are programmed in for bonds that have been authorized for that project. If we are now moving the school reconfiguration to $60 million, then $10 million of that would need to be reprogrammed from the West Main Street project and moved to the school project. So these points are the things that we are starting with as we start developing this budget. We will be looking to you for your input, your guidance in terms of, are we hitting the mark? Are we where you want to be? And if not, then, where does that need to be so that we can best address that in the budget? And that's kind of all we have prepared. We are hoping that, through today, today is the beginning of the conversation. As Chip mentioned, you'll be having regular meetings. You have regular meetings with him weekly, that you will take the opportunity with him to regularly discuss budget issues. You will also work to develop consensus among yourselves so that both the strategic plan and the budget more accurately reflect your priorities and the direction that you would like for it to go.
And Chrissy, if I could I want to emphasize as much as possible your next to last slide of those are the school reconfiguration and the West Main Street are very key points that really set the stage for how we develop the rest of the budget. So those are some talking points, and it's why we pinpointed those out right now, because those will guide how we develop the rest of the budget. And we need to have those conversations sooner rather than later.
Just to make sure, I think I've talked to some counselors and that when we talk about the Walker phase 2, it would be that would be seeking other revenue streams that are beyond the city. So if we think about that sales tax, if that was a possibility, that might be one of the things that would have to fund that. At the same time, that could also be something that helps relieve some of the pressure even on the phase 1 piece. But that was a discussion by the working group that really prioritized getting Buford correct and really getting both the facilities as well as the capacity to what was needed to accommodate the 3 grade levels was determined to be the priority, and getting the 5th graders back in the elementary schools, and then recognizing that Walker would be a facility that would just be able to, I mean, the preschoolers would move into it, but there wasn't going to be a lot of capital investment until we identified another funding source. But there was also just some nuances around the length of time to get to the end of the Buford project. And if we find those other funding sources are available, that Walker could in fact still finish within the same time frame. But right now, with obviously the limitations of our own city dollars, the priority was on this phase 1 for Buford.
And go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Councilor Hill. Very important, and I think a priority is the pursuit of the capital sales opportunity that the General Assembly does allow through referendum strictly for school capital projects. That would be another game changer if we could get that approved. Clearly, it's something we can't budget for. We can't assume it will happen because it's just not that sure, but something to pursue because it would, if I'm stand corrected, I think it's about $10 million a year that would generate for school capital projects. So it would make a huge difference, but something we can't budget for yet.
And I think we do have to be prepared because not all those things still have question marks, those other funding sources. As we've seen in those working groups, we have a community, and I'm the same way, so I'm not seeing it negatively, but who has set its sights on something and that's what they want and that's their vision. And they have a hard time letting go. And just for my colleagues, since I haven't discussed it with you, my comments to the schools, because I think this preschool plan to move the students into that building, that's going to cost us more than people are admitting at this point if they don't change course on that plan. I don't know that it's if we can afford it at that time. So I hope that the school board is at least discussing, some of the changes that they hope to happen based on the fact that we do have to split these projects up. And I am in favor of splitting it up, which I wasn't for a long time. But if when I returned back to the meeting last week before last, whenever it was, it seemed like there were cutting corners to make 2 projects happen simultaneously. And that's not what anybody would want. And I don't think it would give us facilities that our, kids deserve. So those are my comments there. I do have a comment on the slide, the budget cycle slide. I do think that where it says staff planning, forecast, submission, strategic planning, that it should also, that part should say council. And I know I've been very active here. One of my conversations back with Maurice Jones, he said that I, was coming in with a lot of ideas. But last budget cycle, the chat program, which is a big item for me, and I think as we're talking about increasing this 10 cent, there's no way that we cannot figure out how to get that to increase who qualifies for that and the amount that they qualify for. And even though that requires work with staff, one of the things that came out of last cycle was that staff officially got it too late. And so at what point would you want items like that to come in? Because by the time we show up on this in the circle, in this graph, that would be too late based on what occurred last year.
Mayor, I would say I think you and I meet this Friday afternoon. We could begin that discussion on Friday. And I agree. I think that especially if we start assigning a portion of our meetings to talking about the upcoming budget, I can talk to each of the counselors individually and make sure then that collectively you all know what's being put on the plate so that you can then start working together to build that consensus. But as soon as we start meeting, we can start putting that list together so that we have it early enough.
But I still think it should be visual somewhere, because I have participated in budget meetings before I became a counselor. But just, let's say if you have 2 new counselors coming on next year, you will have 5 counselors who are really trying to figure things out still. And I think that them being able to flip through papers and see, like, if I have an idea, that's the time for it, even if there's not someone who is on council sharing that. I just think that's a helpful part of, the process for people to know that if you want your colleagues to consider something, if you need a staff member that you need to work on something with, then you need to be working on that too.
It's easy. We can do that.
Some of my thoughts is one on West Main, which never ceases to come up. As was said, in the past, I think I'm not happy about it, but I just don't see any realistic way to be able to afford school reconfiguration and our other priorities unless we're cutting that. I've seen people say they wish we could do both, but I just haven't seen a realistic argument for how that's possible. The only way I could maybe see it being possible is if there is some kind of infrastructure bill passed by Congress and there's some way we're able to take advantage of that. But that's the only way that to me would seem to make sense, not with our local money, given the money that's going to be required for school reconfiguration. I will say that no new projects being requested gives me a lot of pause. I think we need to have a very real, honest conversation about the specifics of what those trade-offs are going to mean. For me, that makes me nervous because I'm thinking about what if there is an unexpected increase in the cost of public housing redevelopment? What if there's an opportunity to take advantage of state money to ensure long-term affordability for Midway Manor, and we need local matching money? How are we going to fund that $10 million a year for our affordable housing plan? If we're freezing our CIP, every single one of those things is not possible. So it gives me a little bit of pause for us to go all in on saying the CIP budget is completely frozen for new projects if we haven't at least exhausted trying to pursue the opportunity of that sales tax. And the final thought I had right now is, one of the things I've struggled with the previous budget cycle is getting a hold on integrating sort of our higher level initiatives on council with the staff resources needed to execute it. And I'm just curious about if, how those two things could be integrated in terms of, like, we know we want to try to pursue 100% clean and renewable energy by 2050 or implement our affordable housing strategy. Sort of what specific investments are going to be needed to implement it. Because it's, at least I've struggled with seeming like we've passed some ideas or had consensus around ideas, but then there's been no consensus around how to invest to execute it.
I'm just concerned because we struggled to allot 50 million for both schools in our budget, and now we're looking at 60 million for one school. And I mean, I don't know where. I have Michael's same concern about what if something's coming up? How are we supposed to do this, maxing out? I mean, that maxes out our bond capacity entirely. That puts us over in places at times where we should be on our bond capacity for a couple of years there. At the same time, I know Buford and Walker are in desperate need of change. I know there's just really not any good answers here right now. And if we can get the sales tax, that's great, but we do have to plan for if we don't get the sales tax. So how is it going to work if we just rehab Buford but don't do anything to Walker? Because we won't have any more bondable dollars at all. I mean, we're tapped. So how is Walker going to be used, and how does this reconfiguration even happen?
Yeah, so just some thoughts from me. The $50 million was never going to be enough for the schools, and we knew that. And the original, I think 10 years ago, estimates came in around this, 60 to $90 million range. And I understand your point, and that's why I said, especially the housing piece to keep the families who currently live here, and is a big deal. The Affordable Housing Fund, we know that $10 million isn't even enough, even if we figure that $10 million out that originally the consultants were going to propose. I think it was 15. Where they thought we could make a sufficient dent, and so we are not there either. And all of this, I think, plays a major part in what we continue to do, what we cut out, looking at some of the financial policies that we have. And I remember a slide last year where it was, these are the three things that are kind of like tipping the budget over. But we had never, as we were adding to the budget, we didn't subtract anything. And so we added these new priorities, but the old priorities remained at priorities too, because they had already been there. And that is, we're getting to that discussion kind of with West Main, but we haven't, had it thoroughly. And part of the discussions last year that made me really uncomfortable were the conversations around, if we added something, then something staff had requested wouldn't be added. So it kind of pitted what we thought were important or were recommending with what staff is recommending based on departments. And that was one of the reasons why I made the comments earlier about knowing what staff is recommending, because some of the things that certain staff members would say they recommended, I didn't even have any idea that I was proposing something that would knock something they had off or cost the same amount or something like that. And so I just had to accept that feedback, but I hadn't seen what they had even submitted to be able to say, okay, I knew that I was proposing something similar, a dollar amount. So I think that piece is important, but I also think if the foundation of what we're proposing is equity, then everyone is making recommendations based on that. That hasn't necessarily been clear either. And I think we had this discussion last year when we were talking about, what was it, a screen porch or something at the golf course? Something came up there. It was like some extra money, and it's like, should departments be able to just take extra money and use it for something else that comes up? And those items do add up. So I don't know if there is a good way to do this, but if we're going to do something different, then we're going to have to, figure out the financial, support of that. And if we rehab, redevelop new school buildings or whatever part of that, it's going to cost.
I know. I'm just, and I've just been saying this from very early on that, one, I think the community as a whole really does need to understand school reconfiguration is at our doorstep. Are we doing it or are we not doing it? It really feels like, it's a done deal at this point. And I don't know if the general community really understands that and how much it's going to cost and what it's going to mean. I hope people are hearing this right now, that this is going to mean a 10-cent tax increase. I mean, we have to also talk to the schools then if we're doing this, that we can't keep the current assumption that 40% of that is then going to operations to the schools, because then we're just going to have to really have more of a 15-cent or 16-cent tax increase. Because all of that is going to our schools. And again, I have a kid in this school, so just like the majority of counselors do. So I definitely want our schools to be a good quality environment for learning. I don't know, how is this transition going to work if we haven't factored in what's going to happen when Buford's done? Does that mean for a while the fifth graders are just going to stay at Walker until we get money to be able to turn it into school?
No, the plan was that, we discussed this at length, the fifth graders their priority was reconfiguration, meaning that fifth graders would then return back to elementary schools, but we would take the facilities as they are and do our best to make them work for those smaller children for the minimum amount of capital investment until we know where we can get these other funding sources from. So the goal was to get because we did discuss would fifth graders just hang at Walker. That was not the priority scenario. Given what the point of reconfiguration is, try to minimize the transitions and kind of get that priority in place. And so they recognize that that's not an ideal situation, but the consultants kind of talk through scenarios that would allow that to happen without putting a lot of investment up front. Then you're just going to rip away when you actually do the work. And so those are things that were discussed. Really quick.
I have the fifth grader staying, not that this is the place to debate that, but the fifth grader staying is the only option that won't cost us additional monies until we can do that building correctly. And that's just something to consider.
I don't disagree. I think it's for conversation much farther than the working group. Don't disagree. I would say, and I was hoping Christy could weigh in, because I do think there is some clarity that needs to be made about this 10-cent tax increase and the drivers of that, but ultimately reconfiguration is a main driver. So Christy, could you just explain that to the full council and the public?
Sure. So what we presented to you last year was a plan that included the entire CIP plan. It was a plan that talked about or contemplated roughly $185 million worth of projects. That was the dollar amount that got you to your full capacity. So part of what Chip has done with the school group that he spoke to them and spoke to the group last week was that there is a piece of the debt service that belongs entirely just to the school reconfiguration. So of that 10 cents, roughly, if we did a $50 million project, I believe approximately 4 cents of that, it's just for the school reconfiguration only. The other 6 cents that gets you to the 10-cent increase that we're speaking of is then everything else that we have included in the project. So the courts, Belmont Bridge, West Main, if that stays in, all of the other projects. So when we talk about a 10-cent tax increase, also to clarify, last year when we spoke to you about this, one of the reasons why we pushed the school reconfiguration out was to give you an opportunity to have these discussions, to figure out a financing plan, to figure out a way to get this in, and to do the tax increases sort of at a laddered level so that by the time you're ready to issue the debt, you already had the money there to pay for it. If the request is to now move that up and to start that, we are looking at a 10-cent tax increase all at once. There's not the ability to sort of layer that in is not there once you say yes to a $50 million project. So again, to Councilor Payne's point about freezing the CIP, I'm glad you brought that up because I meant to add in as part of that discussion is that we've been coining a phrase that you say a lot about trade-offs and what that might look like in the CIP process in terms of, we don't want to stick our head in the sand and not know what's out there, and not get that information. But if you're going to submit something new to the CIP, then the next question will probably be, well, what can you trade off that is less important that this new thing needs to now replace? Because as Councilor McGill pointed out, you know, the $50 million that we put in the CIP really does max out a lot of things. Your debt service, your CIP, your bonding capacity. And even though they're, you know, the sales tax and these other options that are available to us, they're still probably 2 years out. So again, if we're looking to move this construction up, those are great things that will help down the line, but not in the immediate future.
I know that Governor Northam just had a press release about funding for school rehabilitations. Would we apply for that, or would the school board apply for that?
I saw that, but I have not had a chance to read it in any detail. I did see that there is a match to that program, but I don't know the specifics.
And my understanding, which could be wrong, but my understanding is that it's for HVAC replacements.
Oh, okay. So it's pretty specific then.
Yeah.
But we have those are on the CIP list for schools, right?
They are. Mm-hmm.
We could use that money too. It's not as much as we need, but hey.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the West Main project. I suppose I may be the holdout on, or I guess on this. I became convinced when we thought about it 6 months ago that I really believe that in terms of urban design issues, the West Main Streetscape project is really our future. It's what we need to be working on for the future. It is the equivalent of our downtown mall kind of discussion that our 50 years ago, Mitch Van Yeries and Charles Barber took the bull by the horns and said, yes, we're going to do this. And it was controversial and it was expensive, but it was absolutely the right thing to do. The question is, what can we do that would, with the rest of the budget, that would still enable us to do that? I think it's important when we think about it to keep in mind that the West Main Streetscape project is not fundamentally about cars. It's fundamentally about things like bikes and pedestrians and urban design and a lot of other things, but it's really not about cars. Cars are already able to go up and down West Main Street. That's not the issue. It's everything else that is associated with it that really makes this project important. It's also important to remember that we were already feeling maxed out with $50 million reserved for the schools. And if we're now talking about $80 million or $100 million or whatever the figure is going to turn out to be, we were already at the point that Michael was concerned about. We were already at the point where we didn't have the ability to fund the next affordable housing project. We were already at the point where we had no way to improve West Haven, where we had no way to go to phase 3 of Friendship Court. And so I think we have to acknowledge that there is really only one clear path to being able to do what we need to do. And that is the sales tax increase so that the schools can then be in charge of their own destiny in that respect. If they want to build something that is a $100 million solution, they will then have the ability to do that. And it won't, when they do that, it won't have the same deleterious effects on the rest of the budget. Still got capacity issues, still got cash flow issues. It's not going to be an easy thing to deal with, as Ms. Hamill continues to remind us every time we talk about this, but it's doable if we get that. If we don't get that, then we're in a lot of trouble in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different areas. I am reluctant to plan as though that's going to happen. I am reluctant to make plan. I don't want to be completely rose-colored glasses about it, but the decisions that we would make, not knowing yet whether we would have the ability to do other things, I think that those decisions we may find, 2 years from now, we will have agonized about things. For example, if we say, okay, we're going to go ahead and pull the $18 million for the West Main project, and then a year from now, we find that, or a year and 4 months from now, we find that the bond the sales tax referendum passes, and then we are able to factor in $10 million a year going to school renovations and school construction, and then we can see what else is freed back up again in the capital budget. I just think that we should not make assumptions now that we are not going to be successful in that effort. I think again, as I said, we have to acknowledge that we have to keep our options open, but I think we ought to make plans as though we're going to be able to get the sales tax increase, that we are going to be able to fund the school renovation project the way the school board would want to do it, and then that we are going to be able to move forward with the other capital projects, affordable housing, bike ped improvements, whatever all else they may be. And I say that simply because I don't think that it is worth the effort to, unless it's simply to develop a scare budget out there, I don't think it's worth the effort to try to agonize over things that we're going to cut if in fact we have a straight path. It's not an easy path, but it's at least it's a straight path to being able to make things work. I would like to assume that that's going to happen. If we have to delay some decisions, maybe we have to delay some decisions. The schools would like to move immediately. I don't think we can necessarily sacrifice all the rest of our capital planning simply because they want to be able to move 1 year sooner than what we had discussed. So that doesn't lead me to anything that causes me to want to take a vote on anything today. But those are just sort of my general thoughts as I think about this problem.
Just to touch on a couple of things, Councilor Snook, that you brought up, is that I do think it's with the schools sitting on the committee working on this, it's more of a cost savings to move quicker than it is just a desire to move quicker. The inflationary estimates right now, I don't have to tell any of you, are quite high. And on a project of this size can actually be in the millions between starting earlier and starting later. So I do think that's their initiative to move quicker. I will say too, we will be meeting with VDOT regarding West Main to see what is the absolute last time period that we have to be able to let them know whether we want to maintain or terminate that project. The time is clicking on the very first funding that we received from SmartScale. And while they initially have agreed to us being able to delay that so that we could combine the three phases all together so that they could occur under one contract, they're still limited as to how far they could push that out. And we'll be with VDOT shortly to see, exactly how far we could push that if we had to.
I think that would be very useful.
And it sounds like, it also sounds like at a minimum, that would mean one, a decision point of we want to defer any beginning of school reconfiguration until whether it's known whether there's any state legislation regarding the sales tax, and that if that state legislation doesn't come through, that there is $20+ million worth of CIP projects that we are going to be comfortable cutting.
You're saying if we don't increase the taxes?
No, just if we, and I probably don't agree, but following sort
You're
of.
talking about West Main Street.
Yeah, following Lloyd's argument for maintaining West Main, that's the only way I could see it, as those two decision points. And again, I certainly hope the sales tax increase legislation happens, but it doesn't seem at all like something that we can bank on.
But even if we could, I think that we keep floating around as, with West Main Street, this is the type of decision that we keep trying to do everything that we were planning or people had planned to do. And then if we have these new priorities and if they're based on, something else, yes, it would be nice for people to ride their bikes in the bike lanes that propose, and it would be nice for the trees to be in the soil that's been proposed for that West Main Street. I'm sure that is of some value. Not my expertise, but I have listened to the conversations. But if you're talking about whether people have housing or not, that shouldn't be a discussion that we have to have for 2 years.
And I've said this before, and I mean, relative to West Main, I think the hardest points for me are just the amount of money we're foregoing from other sources and just all the time and investment that's put into this, because we have been known as a city that can't get through projects. I mean, Belmont Bridge has been going on as long as my oldest child has been alive. It's been in part of the design phase. And so we have to become a city that can actually follow through, and there's so much transition and leadership. And so I understand all the points being raised at the same time, like with this level of investment and this much funding from other sources, I do agree with the perspective of just, I'd like to know as much information. I would not want us to look back a year from now because something did follow through with terms of another revenue source and feel like we really we let go of those funding sources from being available, because they're not going to come back again. And it's not insignificant. It's a significant amount of money that we're going to forego, and it's going to go to another community. And so I don't take that decision lightly. At the same time, I certainly agree that it's impossible for us to do it all. And I see what position that we are finding ourselves in. But it's really helpful to hear, other counselors' perspectives on this. And as we kind of work through this, I anticipate that we're going to need to have a joint session with the schools, probably sooner versus later. And I know that some of them have expressed interest in that. And I'm not sure, Mr. Boyles, if that's something, what time frame you might want us to consider for that. But I think that's a logical step as well.
But I think for that meeting is scheduled, we need to make a decision about the project. Unless we're saying, based on the information we hear from the schools, we'll make a decision about the project. We know what they want. We know one of the factors that is increasing CIP debt services. And so it just needs, at some point, a decision has to be made. And it's important to maxing out any budget is important. And that's something that I've been getting some heat for. West got a lot of heat for. But you see how hard it is to prioritize things related to equity. If you look at all the initiatives West started when he was on council, the Daniel's position, I think in human services, is probably the only thing that's still intact. And so those things required funding, and related to equity and trying to think about how to impact families directly and not in this roundabout way. And that is not something that we've been trying to get there, but it's been a very slow pace in getting to those things. Even CHAP program, yes, we are much better position than we was before I got here and started working on it, but we haven't matched that with the developments that we've approved and what that means for families who live in our neighborhoods. And part of that holistic look at when we are making a decision, how it affects people. And if we're saying we haven't increased CHAP, I think we increased it twice. And yeah, so then the last 2 budget cycles, I don't think there was an increase to it. It's not somehow making sense in my head, but I think that's accurate. And then I'm thinking of neighborhoods like the 10th and Page, Grady Avenue, that neighborhood, like what that looks like. So those are the type of things that we need to be focused on when we are talking about maxing out, not if we are going to continue, in my opinion, continue projects like West Main Street. Getting to $15 million for affordable housing, like was going to be recommended, figuring those type of things out. And then after we've done that, well, then we should be maybe considering projects like that.
Well, I guess my final comment would be, as I said earlier, the challenge I just see is we have, a ton of needs in the community, but a limited budget, limited resources. We can't run a deficit, so we're going to be forced to make trade-off decisions. And I'm comfortable, with the trade-off of not continuing with West Main unless there's money from the federal government. But even if we do that, what I'm not comfortable with is that even with a 10-cent sales increase in tax, if we pursue school reconfiguration without a sales tax increase with the state legislation, it means, again, no ability, if there are unexpected increases in the cost of redevelopment of public housing, unavailable to take advantage of any potential opportunities with Midway Manor or other LIHTC properties that have affordability periods ending, and no ability to actually fund our adopted affordable housing plan at even $10 million a year. Those are some trade-offs that I'm not comfortable with, saying that we're 100% foreclosing those opportunities. And so at a minimum, I'm definitely very interested in at least seeing if anything happens with that sales tax legislation, in really making it a priority to advocate for that this General Assembly session. Because if we get that, that would completely change this conversation and make a lot more things feasible. And I think it, at least for me, because I don't want to foreclose those housing and other considerations, really, at least in the short term, going all in on advocating for that sales tax legislation and seeing what happens. And if it doesn't happen, then we evaluate and go forward from there.
I definitely agree with that. I guess my question, Michael, is, do you, like Lloyd was alluding to, do you feel that we should, what do you think of the time frame which the school projects, obviously recognizing that Chip has raised the point that yes, there is an inflationary consideration, but not knowing right now about the sales tax outcome, but knowing that we all are committed to wanting to go pursue that. What are your thoughts on time frame?
Yeah, I haven't been as involved with those conversations with the school board, so I'm not 100% sure, but I would say my understanding would seem to be that if we're speeding up that timeline to start it earlier before anything is known about whether that sales tax legislation happens, that would mean we're saying that, I don't know. I mean, I guess if the sales tax legislation still happened, you're just increasing the risk, I guess, that we're blocked from doing anything about housing. I'm not totally sure of my thoughts on that.
And the sales tax legislation will require a referendum that would go along with the next election cycle here. So that would be what year is it, 21, 23, right?
It would be 22.
November 22.
22, okay.
Chip, do we find out if there was another opportunity before a general election that a referendum could be put in front of the city?
I have not been able to find out yet, but we are inquiring about it. if a special election could be held.
If so, we also have to factor in that cost. A special election isn't cheap. And it's kind of
Are there no primaries
a
next
matter of
year?
a few months.
I don't think we can do it at the time of a primary. But my broader concern is that if we're going to have a referendum, I want it to be a referendum at a time when we can be reasonably likely to have a large turnout. An off-year congressional election in 2022 is not going to be a huge turnout, but it's not going to be a small turnout. It'll be, frankly, larger than most of the turnouts that we had for city council before we moved to November. But having a special election at a time, and that gets difficult to know what the turnout's going to look like. From a purely Democratic with a small d perspective, that would concern me.
Good point.
But even, I think having that conversation with waiting for that information, what that means in terms of dollars, you know, for the project and the length of time that could take. Because then even if it was 2022, it would be July, right, 2023 before we could start, that the sales tax would be, starting to, dollars would start coming in from that. And so that's just, something to think about.
How
Actually,
are projects like this paid? Are they paid, like, so when I hire somebody to come work at my house, often we'll pay a retainer fee. I know maybe I'll pay a mid project fee and then I pay at the end. Is that how a city project works as well?
Yeah, they're billed on generally percent complete with some type of retainer until the end.
Christy, I think she wants you to talk about maybe what you were talking about at the last meeting about why we couldn't phase in the increase, maybe. Is that part of?
Well, I was kind of wondering, so if we did start it, obviously we're not selling the bonds until we actually need to sell them. So till they're actually going to pay somebody. So if we had started the project and then the sales tax does pass, can we kind of like switch over and start having the sales tax paying that? Or would we be able to use that sales tax to pay back that debt services associated with the schools?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's probably the better way to do it. Again, we can work through a bunch of scenarios. I think at the end of the day, though, if we're contemplating a $50 million project, we have to have a way to pay debt service on $50 million as soon as we say yes to the project. And even though we won't be selling, the bonds until we're ready to pay the bills, and it might be, 25% year one and 35% year two or something like that, we can only vote a tax rate on July 1, and you can't borrow, you can't sign a contract for $50 million with only a portion of that funded. And, every council and every year brings out new priorities. And so, you can do a lot of things, but you've got to have that payment for sure. That's got to be paid.
Chrissy, do you know, is it, I was going to try to look it up during the meeting, but I haven't been able to find the links. Is it possible to change a sales tax rate in the middle of a fiscal year?
I do not know. I would have to defer to Ms. Robertson or someone else with more expertise than me.
I mean, the reason I ask is I think that I remember having seen that some of the counties that have had these referenda have made provision for the sales tax increase to take effect at some point other than on July 1. So that you could have a referendum, for example, that would say, let's have the sales tax increase go into effect April 1. something like that. Here comes Ms. Robertson to answer the question for us.
Yeah, in general, I can tell you that there are some statutes that address the circumstances under which you can change a tax rate mid-year. And I'm sorry, I don't have specifics in front of me because to my knowledge, at least in the years I've been here, Charlottesville hasn't done that, but there are some limited statutory provisions that do allow you to change your tax rate mid-year after some procedural compliance. But I can give you a more specific information about the circumstances if you give me a little time to do some research.
I think sales taxes are different in that respect from real estate taxes, for example.
Yeah.
Councilor Snook, I am looking at a news article from Henry County that the General Assembly approved a sales tax increase for them that took effect April 1st.
That's what I thought I remembered, yeah.
Yeah.
And presumably it could be effective January 1st, but for whatever difficulties there may be and just sort of procedurally making sure that people are up to speed by that date.
I'm not against the sales tax increase. I mean, the real estate tax increase. I wasn't thinking either or, I was thinking and.
It's going to take and.
Yeah, I know. But I also do want to make sure that it's really clear that if the sales tax, if we have agreed to go forward with Buford at $60 million and are cutting all sorts of things from the capital budget and kind of freezing ourselves from jumping on potential opportunities that could come about with either purchasing land or other, that we are, if the sales tax does come through, that we are then not using all of that for, like, that's not looked at as being this bonus for more school stuff, because we're going to need that to offset some of the Buford stuff as well.
Well, the sales tax dollars we have to put towards schools, like that's one of the requirements, but it would free up the other revenue streams like our tax increase, our real estate tax increase for us to use towards other priorities. But this the kind of part of the beauty of this sales tax, it actually is very deliberate in that it's for capital improvements for schools up to a certain number of years.
Yes, I just want to make sure that it's not thought to be 60 million in bonds from real estate tax plus the sales tax to then go totally towards updating Walker or something like that. That's I just want to be really.
No, that's an important point because
clear.
The way that we've talked about phase 2 in the working group was that it could only be funded if a new revenue source came to fruition, namely the sales tax increase. And so that's a good point because that is something that's been contemplated and that would be the source of revenue. Anybody else in that work group can let me know if I'm misspeaking, but.
Yeah, I think that's where we have arrived at, maybe possibly understanding, but I think there's some work still there.
And that just brings me back to, I do think it is important for us to figure out what is the right time in advance of our October decision-making for us to be regrouping with the full school board to discuss some of the details. Because obviously some of us are on a working group, we have more information and we, much as we try to share and disseminate, I think there's value for the school board too, just to have a broader, robust discussion, given the enormity of what we're talking about here.
And I would just add one other point as you think about this is to really kind of think about the general fund and the CIP together. As you talk about raising real estate tax or even sales tax to go towards a school reconfiguration or a school project, keep in mind, you know, your growth in your general fund is only available through revenue sources as well. And so if you use all of that revenue for the CIP, you also don't have the opportunity to grow your general fund at the same rate.
Which means raises for our staff, which means assistance to human services or other economic initiatives or the mental health initiatives and matching the Marcus alert, and those kinds of things.
The revenue sources we would have were any organic growth in revenue just from new real estate coming online or obviously assessment changes. So those would be the only other increases that we would anticipate. Right, Chrissy?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd have to figure out how we structure that. You know, right now what we're talking about is 10 cents on the current assessment rate. So however we decided to frame that in the resolution, whether it be an equivalent of 10 cents now or we do a dollar amount, would dictate whether or not that additional growth is available. Then that would be an important point that we'd have to work through.
No, that's a good point, because often we do see increases that we haven't made consciously, but they have happened just by the movement of the market. And maybe we would want to just lock in that this is a maximum and not a this and. So that's a good point. Thank you.
Yeah, and based on the discussions that happened with the assessment, which wasn't the thought I just had, so I don't want to lose it, but I think we should talk about that a bit more. But so the school operational funding recalibration, is that a discussion we are having that, or that we are going to have with the school board? Because the other proposal that was thrown out there, which I guess fits right into this, was a portion of the money that goes to them operationally, $1 million or so, being, I guess, not being transferred to them, but being transferred directly to debt services annually.
Yes, what we will be doing is, as we discussed at the school working meeting, is now that we know that capital dollar amount that we're working from of $60 million, we'll begin running some different scenarios of how to fund that debt service on that. And we believe some of those options will include taking from the operating fund that we have been funding to the schools.
Yeah. And we have to consider, you know, Sina just talked about raises for employees, but we have, you know, I made the point that I don't think we're doing a very good job of taking care of our employees. But we also now, with the collective bargaining, employees will be able to tell us what that means for them. So those will be costs that we have to consider, trying to look at what we offer them holistically, like leaving the retirement out of the benefits for transit and pupil, or no, just pupil. I think, I don't know where new transit drivers is. That's a question that I have. And, you know, those type of, the CAT drivers, once the CARES and American Rescue dollars are gone, the fire department increase, that's up. What year is that? 2024? And this 4.5, I guess 4.8 or 9, that with the school bus drivers and the money for the schools next year, all of that has to be factored in too, and that's already been approved. And I don't know if you all have plugged that into the budget and are able to tell us what that means in terms of remaining, or where we are just with those increases.
So we're not quite that far along. Just to give you a gauge though, we were looking at approximately for our projections, roughly just a general reassessment growth of about 3%. That equates to about $1.9 million as compared to the $4.5 million operational school increase that we've been talking about.
And even I think with the CHAP program, that increase probably, it was $600,000 for the next phase, I think was the amount that, and I don't have that in front of me. So if there need to be 2 more, we're probably looking at another $1.5 million on top of maybe that 600,000.
Yes. I think it was it 600,000, Ryan? Does that?
Yeah, it was $600,000 to kind of combine the programs together and work on a changing of the levels and getting the levels at the appropriate. I think it was somewhere between $600,000 and $670,000. I don't remember the exact figure in front of me, but that would both combine the programs and create a little bit of an increase in some of the levels. I don't have all the details in front of me right now.
But that was only a slight increase. That wasn't trying to work our way towards the goal of having up to the around like $60,000 a year, get some tax benefits, and those who are under the 45 into that tax 100%. So if we are looking at those 2 projection, I think it was an additional.
Yeah, I would have to double check with Commissioner Divers on that, as like I said, I don't have all the details pulled up in front of me, but I know there was some additional cost. His proposal that he had submitted to us for potential consideration, which was received, kind of later in the budget process, was about $600,000 to do the combination of the processes. I think there was potentially an additional cost should we look at changing the levels, but I think that was also in his recommendation a phased approach. If we were to even do that, was to start off with the combination of the programs in year 1 and not look at changing the levels and get the combination of the program right and get the usage right, and then be able to make projections on after we see what that combined usage would be, what it would look like to do changes in the levels and get to the 65,000 like you're talking about.
Yeah. And that was my comment. I don't think we have to get to 65,000 this year. But even with those increase, I'm just saying it will cost money. And though that is a project that we've delayed, I think, the past 2 cycles to wait. Last cycle, we didn't add, or this budget that just started. And the last time we did give, I think, the $250 towards it, but we didn't make a long-term program change in the cycle before that. And so those are the type of things that get put on hold. And at the rate our families are being pushed out the communities, those are the type of things we have to consider, I think, as a top priority.
And I think it's safe to say that when we're talking about this kind of a tax increase, to backfill the CHAP, like to be able to kind of hold those CHAP recipients and maybe more, steady, is probably going to cost us 1.5 cents of that increase. Maybe I'm just throwing numbers out there based on what I always understood there to be. 1 cent tax increase is worth X, but I'm just want us to be realistic about that, because I do feel like it's going to be important that we make those programs more robust if we're talking about this kind of an increase, so that we aren't, we're not hurting the families that we certainly have been focusing on over these years to try to maintain in the city and not be tax burdened. I mean, Christine, is that kind of rough swag?
Based on the 22 projection for what 1 cent was, and the numbers that the mayor was quoting, that would be a rough estimate. Now we'd have to factor in any potential assessment growths and other factors, but that's in the general ballpark.
Well, this has been a very uplifting conversation. Thank you all.
Medicine.
So what decision points do we need right now, any? Or is this just kind of ironing the skids?
I mean, as long as these are the figures we're moving forward with. I think that's the main thing to know. Unless we hear different from council, the budget team will be using the dollar amounts we've been talking about, the tax increases we've been talking about, in our budget development. So the real thing we need to know from you all is at what point any of these may change. But if not, these are the figures we will be using to initiate the budget process.
Can't see the 10 cents real estate tax changing unless it goes up, honestly.
And one thing I will say we're working on now is to get you, and there is no way to compare apples to apples with this, but it does, I think, help, is we're looking at some of our peer cities around Virginia and what their current tax rates are, just so that you can compare.
And from a timing perspective, that deliverable we've talked about with the working group and you've referenced today, Chip, around just all the alternatives of how this will be paid for. When do we think we're going to have that from the staff, both to share with the schools and to share with the full council?
We really haven't talked about that yet, so I'd be afraid to say, but it's something we're certainly can work on very quickly. I mean, we can initiate that. Let us put our heads together on that.
I'm mostly just thinking about October is when I think we have this decision point kind of time frame that I know the consultants for the schools have talked about, and I think it would just be helpful just to have all of that information at the ready, well in advance of that.
Oh, well advance of that, yes.
And in terms of the West Main Street decision, when will that come before us for a vote?
I think one of the key information points is how far VDOT is willing to let us push out a decision as to when that project would have to move forward before they themselves would terminate the project. So we've got that meeting coming up. I think I mentioned to you earlier, the district engineer for the Culpeper district has left, and he's the person we've been talking about with this project. So we're setting up a meeting with the interim engineer for Culpeper. And I think that's either this week or next week. So we'll start having an idea of what type of time frame that we know we have to act before.
Okay, so this should, at least by the second meeting in August, we should.
Yeah.
Okay.
The VDOT meeting is next Friday.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam.
Next Friday, the 6th. Okay. Okay, so is there anything else that we need to do today?
Not from our standpoint. Thank you so much. Though not a lot of positive discussions, but still very, very helpful for us. And appreciate the comments and the support on the strategic planning. We still have a ways to go with that to get it to where we want it, but I think we're moving in the right direction. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Meeting adjourned.
Oh, okay.
Oh. Did you have a comment?
No, I just wasn't sure if we had public comment or anything like that today.
Oh, thank you, Sina.
You're welcome.
Mr. Willer, yeah, let's check.
Thank you, Mayor Walker. We have 8 people in the audience right now. If you'd like to address council for up to 3 minutes, please click the raise hand icon in the Zoom webinar. We're now down to 7, and I don't see any hands raised, Mayor Walker.
Okay, thank you. All right, meeting adjourned.
Thanks.